Okay? Now, let us define communication. Communication is a process of interacting and sharing thoughts and ideas with other people. Of course, communication does not only occur in a face to face conversation, it also happens in the different mode or setup, like the use of technology where we can communicate using various applications like Messenger, Google Meet, Skype, Tinder, and etc. And I know that you are all familiar with those applications, most especially today that we are already technology savvy. So, how can we say that communication fails? Of course, communication fails when there is misunderstanding. Misunderstanding happen because of some circumstances. One example of which is cultural barrier. If we are not familiar or if we are not aware of the cultural differences, people sometimes are misinterpreted. If you are going to look at the picture, men at the middle do not actually understand why those two men bow. He thought that they are interested with his shoes, where in fact the two men are only bowing as a sign of respect. And this kind of gesture is seen from Korean and Japanese people. So this picture also shows the differences in greeting people, just like in the previous slide. This clearly presents how important knowing the cultural background of the person you are communicating with. Since we are already globalized, we cannot avoid talking to foreigners, most especially if you are already professionals. It's like when you are in a company and you are tasked to have a meeting with different people, it is necessary that you check the background so that you won't be misinterpreted. All right, so let us try to understand the process of communication. Communication begins with the source or the sender or the speaker. He is the one who encodes. Okay, when we say encoding, the sender is using certain words, symbols, signs, and body gestures to translate the information into a message. Then the message is sent through communication channels. Okay, channel or medium. Channel is the medium through which the message is conveyed. For example, when the boy is trying to court a girl and he cannot just tell how in love he is, so he thought of sending flowers to the girl. This act of giving flower is the communication channel being used by the sender. Then as the receiver receives the message, okay, he or she will decode it. Decoding is interpreting the sender's message and trying to understand and comprehend it. Then that is the time that the receiver gives his or her own feedback or response. This is the final step of the process that ensures that he or she has received or understand the message. And of course, whenever we communicate, there is this noise and we call it as communication barrier. Okay? So what is communication barrier? This one hinders the communicators to send his ideas clearly. These barriers does not only pertain to literal meaning of noise. Emotions is also an example and can also affect the communication process. So that is understanding the communication process. So let us give the description of each element in the process of communication. The sender. The sender or the communicator is the person who initiates the conversation and has conceptualized the idea that he intends to convey it to others. Encoding. The sender begins with the encoding process wherein he uses certain words or nonverbal methods such as symbols, signs, body gestures, and etc. to translate the information into a message. The sender's knowledge, skills, perception, background, competencies, and etc. has a great impact on the success of the message. The message, once the encoding is finished, the sender gets the message that he intends to convey. The message can be written, oral, symbolic, or nonverbal, such as body gestures, silence, sighs, sounds, etc., or any other signal that triggers the response of a receiver. Communication channel. The sender chooses the medium through which he wants to convey his message to the recipient. It must be selected carefully in order to make the message effective and correctly interpreted by the recipient. The choice of medium depends on the interpersonal relationships between the sender and the receiver, and also on the urgency of the message being sent. Oral, virtual, written, sound, gesture, and etc. are some of the commonly used communication mediums. The receiver is the person for whom the message is intended or targeted. He tries to comprehend it in the best possible manner such that the communication objective is attained. The degree to which the receiver decodes the message depends on his knowledge of the subject matter, experience, trust, and relationship with the sender. Decoding. Here, the receiver interprets the sender's message and tries to understand in the best possible manner. An effective communication occurs only if the receiver understands the message in exactly the same way as it was intended by the sender. And the last element is feedback. The feedback is the final step of the process that ensures the receiver has received the message and interpreted it correctly as it was intended by the sender. It increases the effectiveness of the communication as it permits the sender to know the efficacy of his message. The response of the receiver can be verbal or nonverbal. The different types of communication are intrapersonal communication and interpersonal communication. Under interpersonal communication, that is divided into four, but let us try to discuss first intrapersonal communication. Intrapersonal is communicating with oneself. This may be seen whenever we are talking or writing to ourselves. Example of it is talking in front of the mirror, okay, memorizing out loud a dialogue, and writing in your diary or private blog. For interpersonal communication, it involves more than one person. So let's try to divide it into four. Let's start with the first one, which is dyadic communication. Dyadic communication involves two participants forming the dyad or in partner, meaning there is one speaker and one listener. For letter B, small group communication, this requires 3 to 15 people to study an issue or discuss a problem. It has an agenda and a leader, and of course, an outcome to finish. The third one is public communication, where it has one speaker and has a specific audience. There is no interchanging of the roles of the speaker and the listener. The example of this is the State of the Nation address of the President, or SONA. Okay? The last one is mass communication. It is a human verbal interaction carried out with the use of mass media technology. Example of it is newscasting. That reaches more people locally and internationally. There are two kinds of communication, the verbal and the nonverbal communication. Verbal encompasses the use of language and words, while nonverbal uses facial expressions, gestures, signs and symbols, and even bodily language. These two must be used together to impart the message clearly, because sometimes misunderstanding happens when words contradict actions. So another is when we use technology to communicate. Sometimes all caps or words in the uppercase are misinterpreted as mad or a person is in the height of emotions. But of course, this kind of circumstances are unavoidable, especially during this pandemic, where the most used form of communication is technology. Now let us define the three models of communication. Let's start with the first one, which is linear model of communication, or also known as Aristotle model of communication. This is the process of transmitting information between the sender and the receiver. The success of communication in this model depends on how the receiver absorbs the message. In this model, the receiver has no chance to give feedback to the sender's message. Example is when you are listening to a speech where people or where a person is not allowed to share thoughts and ideas on that specific topic being discussed by the speaker. So that is linear model of communication. The next one is the Schramm's model of communication, where encoding and decoding of the message is involved. Each person is both a sender and receiver, so there must be an interpretation of the message on each turn. This makes communication effective but might cause problems too. There is communication breakdown due to the different field of experience of the listener and the different field of experience of the sender. For example, an English teacher is delivering her lecture in Engalog, or what we call English than Tagalog. Other students may appreciate it because they can easily understand the lesson, but others may not like it because they would want to master the English language by immersing themselves in the English speaking environment. And that is an example of Schramm's model of communication. The last one is transactional model. This is the most general model of communication. Every day as we interact is also a form of transactional model of communication. In this model, efficiency and reliability of communicated message also depends on the medium used. For example, the message might not be perceived by a person the same way when it is sent through Facebook Messenger and when it is done face to face. It is because of the possible loss of message on an FB Messenger or phone call, or sometimes because of the absence of gestures. So there are different factors affecting transactional model. So you can see there the relationship models in the field of experience. Okay, it involves the environmental noise, which includes physical noise as well as psychological noise. The responses of an individual cannot be predicted because they have different background and mental conditions. One thing is the cultural system, the social system, and the relational situations. These are the most overpowering elements of this model, while the physical and the psychological enhances communication. So when we talk about the field of experience and the relationship dimensions, social context is also involved because society has a great impact in shaping our way in communicating with other people. An example is greeting people when meeting, thanking, and even apologizing. We learn from a trial and error process, and its consequences ranges from embarrassment. This is due to cultural differences, like the example that I have given you a while ago. So under relationship dimensions again, so we have this relational context of communication. This relates to relationship history and also manners. For example, a person talks differently with an old friend than a stranger. Okay? You talk differently to a teacher than your parents or friends because that depends on a person you are talking to or talking with. So that is example, or those are examples of transactional model of communication.